The exile. Why is this important? I believe the exile is the greatest theological conundrum that the Hebrew Bible has. It is the greatest theological predicament and problem. So when you and I think about theology, one of the ways in which we should be thinking about it is that it helps answer questions. Sometimes we hear that it's not a good idea, it's not advisable, it's not acceptable to ask God questions. Why? Particularly that question. Why? And yet, for those of us that have lived long enough, and for some of us that's to the age of 10, for some of it's to the age of 40, but at some point we end up asking, why did this happen to me? Or why did this happen to grandma? Or why did this happen to my spouse? Why is this happening? And where is God in all of this? This kind of question that seeks to square the idea that there is a good God and yet persistence of evil. Maybe it's the persistence of sickness, right? That's the question of what's called theodicy. 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 It is asking how these two ultimates exist side by side. God, the ultimate good, and ultimate evil, and everything in between. How do we figure that stuff out? The exile for Hebrew people, for Jewish people, is just such a conundrum. God promised us the land. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. We talked about that a couple of sessions ago. God promised us the land, and now we don't have the land anymore. Israel is taken into exile in Babylon in the the turning from the 7th to the 6th century BCE, and then in about 538, 539 BCE, they're released to go back to the land. But even that doesn't really resolve this kind of exile question. The political situation has changed, and they're not really self-ruling anymore. They're in the land, but it's not really their land. The exile is really, really a problem. My favorite psalm is actually a so-called lament psalm, where there's this community crying out to God. It begins, Psalm 137 begins, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept for Zion. And as you read through, the writer is lamenting the fact that they can't sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. Well, Israel comes back to the land, right? I just mentioned that. They come back to the land. But as they experience the land again over the next 500-600 years, there still is not that, it's never like it was before. And this is a theological question that's happening even at the beginning of the New Testament era. Are we still in exile? And with the dominance of the Romans, it's very possible that many people in the New Testament in Palestine felt like they were exiled in their own country. Some of the Magnificat betrays that same kind of political reality. So not only do I read the Magnificat thinking about the poor versus the rich and God's favor on the poor, God's help for the poor, that kind of thing, but I also think about this text in relation to the political realities. The raising up of the lowly, right? Does that have reference? Because Mary seems to, in the first 4 or 5 verses, concentrate her rejoicing on what's happening with her, but then it extrapolates out from there in the last 4 or 5 verses about how this impacts all of Israel. So is there a political reality that's in mind here, that the lowly that are being raised up are the people of God's own name, if you will, and the people being lowered would be these other bones, right? These Romans who have oppressed us, and that that did take place. So when I read the Magnificat, I'm thinking about another layer. I'm thinking about rich versus poor. I'm thinking about the Old Testament realities. I'm thinking about the current New Testament era political climate, and all of that in relation to exile. What does it mean for these folks to be exiled in their own land? Is that going on here in this text? Those are the kinds of questions I bring to this one. So the Romans, they're in charge. We've got the Herods there, and this is a group that's basically they are usurpers. They should not be on the throne in terms of how Israel conceived of its own kingship under Saul first, but then really under David and Solomon and the heirs to what we call this the Davidic line, Davidic dynasty. That is the group of leaders that comes out of the family and line of David. But not only do you have that political climate there resulting from this whole concept of exile, but there's also a cultural component to this. And part of that involves hope for the future, hope for something different, hope for self-rule, and that of course is related to politics as well, but it's also related to what it means to be this people. So we might be a nation, but within the nation we have, peoples, right? We have families, we have cultures, maybe even of various geographical regions. My wife and I spent 5 years in Kentucky, and that culture is different than the culture in California where we live now, or in New Hampshire where we lived for a couple of years. Certainly different than North Dakota where we lived for a couple of years. We've obviously lived all over the country, and each one of these places has a different kind of cultural context. One of the other things that figures into this in terms of culture is how religion plays into it. So Israel thinks of itself as having a unique relationship before God. They are the people of his own pleasure. They are the people that he calls into being. I will be your God and you will be my people, is what we see starting in the book of Exodus as God interacts with Moses. There's the culture of monotheism. So the Romans, for example, the Greeks, for example, many gods. There's a pantheon of gods. But Israel is very specific, and that carries through both from the Old through the New Testament, that there is one God, monotheism. And that is a defining characteristic of what it means to be this people. And it impacts the way the Romans and the Jews deal with one another, and cleanliness and uncleanliness and acceptance. It's easier if you are a practitioner of polytheism to accept another polytheist. Monotheist, if there's one God, that means that all the other gods are not really gods. And so there's between a polytheist and a monotheist, there is a butting up against where one cannot go further than the limitation of that monotheistic belief, and that will impact all of the cultural understanding, because then your culture is ordered by what you think the one God would have you to do. Then we have the land. How do we have this land by divine right from Abraham and from God through Abraham, and yet we can't exercise our own free, liberated self-determination? That is a cultural problem as well. Within this group in the New Testament, you do have within the Jewish family, you do have different sects, S-E-C-T-S. The ones that come most readily to mind are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and these two groups have radically different ways of thinking about interaction with the Romans, and certainly thinking about theological ideas. It's easy to just reduce the conversation between the two of them is to just a theological conversation about resurrection. But the Pharisees believed in it, the Sadducees didn't. But resurrection, as New Testament theologian Tom Wright, I think, has shown effectively, resurrection is more than just about whether the body will be raised, but it is about whether the nation will be raised again. And the Sadducees are pretty happy with the way the arrangement is, and they don't see a need for a resurrection. They're happy with the way they're interacting with the Romans. The Pharisees are a little bit more open to more self-determination on the part of the Jewish people. You have the Essenes, and that's the group that gives us the Dead Sea Scrolls that are found in 1948 in the northwest part of the Dead Sea, the community out there at Qumran. And you have the Zealots. Now, the Essenes, they pulled back. They went away. They're like, we're done with this whole climate there in Jerusalem. And about 200 years before Christ, not quite that long, but rounding off, they just say, we're getting out of town, and they remove themselves. But the Zealots, they want to really engage the Romans. They want to engage them violently. They want to do what their theological interpretation called for them to do, which was to rescue the land, just as Judas Maccabeus had done in about the 160s, 170s before Christ. Rescue the land from the dominance of the Romans. And so you got all this cultural stuff happening, you got all this political stuff happening, you got all these various groups having different takes on how we deal with this bunch called the Romans. And it's into that context that, wow, God encounters humankind with this young woman in Palestine named Mary.